What's up everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. Former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. I've been covering this Iran war pretty much week by week as it's kept escalating. Small boats, radar sites, bridges, power plants. But I want to pump the brakes for a second and go back to the single most significant weapon that's been used in this entire conflict. Because I don't think enough people actually understand what it is, what it took to build it, or just how much this one bomb has shaped the entire strategic calculus of this war. I'm talking about the GBU-57, the massive ordnance penetrator, better known as the bunker buster. This thing is genuinely one of the most fascinating pieces of hardware in the entire US arsenal, and I want to break down exactly what it is, how it's actually been used against Iran, and why the Air Force is right now scrambling to rebuild its supply of these things. I'm going to walk through what the GBU-57 actually is and how it physically works, then cover Operation Midnight Hammer, the strike that put this weapon on the map for the entire world to see, then the follow-on strikes later in this war where this weapon or something like it may have been used again. Then I'll get into why the Air Force just signed a new contract to rebuild its stockpile, and I'll finish with my take on what this weapon actually means for how this entire war has been fought. So let's start with the basics. The GBU-57, officially the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, is a 30,000-pound guided bomb. And I want you to actually sit with that number for a second, because that's not a typo. That's about 15 tons of bomb in a single weapon. It's about 20.5 feet long. And for comparison, most of the precision-guided bombs you hear about in the news, JDAMs and the like, are in the 500 to 2,000-pound class. This thing is an entirely different category of weapon. The reason it's built that heavy is the entire design philosophy. This isn't a blast weapon meant to destroy something on the surface. It's a penetrator, meaning the whole point of the weapon is to physically punch through earth, rock, and reinforced concrete before it ever detonates, and only explode once it's deep underground, inside whatever hardened structure it's targeting. The Air Force has publicly stated it's capable of penetrating up to around 200 feet of earth, or roughly 60 feet of reinforced concrete, depending on the specific material it's punching through. It's carried exclusively by the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. That's the only aircraft in the US inventory actually built and certified to carry and release this weapon. And that's not incidental. You need a platform that can get deep into contested airspace, undetected, to actually deliver something this specialized against a heavily defended target. This weapon was developed specifically from day one with one type of target in mind: deeply buried, hardened facilities that a country builds specifically to survive a conventional bombing campaign. Things like underground nuclear enrichment sites or hardened command bunkers. And there's one target in particular that basically drove the entire multi-decade development of this weapon, and that target is Fordo. Fordo is Iran's uranium enrichment facility, built deep into a mountainside, specifically because Iran knew that burying it that deep would make it extremely difficult for any conventional weapon to actually reach it. According to senior US military officials, the weapon's development was directly driven by the need to hold that specific facility at risk. And by their own account, this was 15 years in the making, with individual officers studying that target for over a decade, tracking the geology, watching the construction as it happened, mapping every ventilation shaft and access point long before any decision to actually strike it was made. That strike finally happened during Operation Midnight Hammer when 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, each carrying 2 of these weapons, dropped a total of 14 GBU-57s across 2 target areas, Fordo and Natanz, while separately, Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from a US submarine hit a 3rd nuclear-related site at Isfahan. According to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the actual targeting technique against Fordo specifically involved dropping a sequence of bombs down the facility's ventilation shafts, the first weapon used to force open the cap covering the shaft, with the following weapons then traveling down into the underground complex itself before detonating deep inside, and 1 additional weapon per shaft held in reserve specifically as a backup in case any of the preceding weapons or aircraft didn't perform as expected. Military officials said all of the weapons at each target reached exactly where they were intended to go, and that initial assessments found extremely severe damage across all 3 nuclear sites that were struck. That operation genuinely reshaped how people think about deeply buried, hardened targets globally, because for years there'd been real debate in the defense community about whether any conventional weapon could actually reach a facility buried as deep as Fordo. Some estimates put parts of that complex more than 80 meters underground. Having that capability demonstrated in actual combat for the first time ever was a massive validation of a program that had been in development for a decade and a half, without ever having been used operationally before that mission. Now here's where this gets even more interesting, because there's reporting that suggests this same class of weapon or something functioning very similarly, has potentially been used again later in the same war against a different target entirely. Satellite imagery analysis identified a set of very large, precise impact points at a facility called Taligan 2, located within Iran's Parchin military complex, a site linked to Iran's past nuclear weapons research under what was known as the AMAD project. In the weeks leading up to that strike, satellite imagery had shown Iran actively working to harden that facility, building what analysts described as a concrete shell over the site, and then burying large parts of it under soil, exactly the kind of defensive hardening you'd expect a country to attempt against precisely this category of weapon. Here's where it gets genuinely murky, though, and I want to be straightforward about that murkiness rather than pretend this is more settled than it actually is. Israel's military publicly claimed credit for striking that facility, but Israel's not known to possess the GBU-57 at all. The MOP is a uniquely American capability. Israel's largest known bunker busters are in the 2,000 to 5,000 pound class, nowhere near the 30,000 pound class of the American weapon. So you've got impact points at Taligan 2 that visually resemble what was seen at Fordow and Natanz after Midnight Hammer, but a public Israeli claim of credit for the strike despite Israel not having the weapon that would produce those kinds of impact points. And neither the Pentagon nor Israel has ever fully clarified exactly which aircraft or which munitions were actually used there. It's entirely possible other, smaller bunker-busting munitions were used in succession to achieve a similar effect. That's a technique that's been discussed publicly by defense analysts as an alternative way to defeat a hardened target without needing the full-size American weapon. I raise all of this specifically because I think it's a good example of how much uncertainty still surrounds even some of the most consequential strikes of this entire war. And I'd rather flag that honestly than pretend there's a clean, fully confirmed answer. This is the part of the story that I think is actually the most telling about how seriously this weapon is being treated going forward. Earlier this year, the Air Force awarded Boeing a contract worth over $62 million specifically to replenish the GBU-57 inventory after its use in combat. That's a significant signal on its own. This isn't a mass-produced weapon sitting in huge stockpiles somewhere. It's a low-density, high-consequence capability, meaning there aren't very many of these things built at any given time. And using a meaningful number of them in an actual operation creates a real gap in national readiness that has to be deliberately and expensively closed. Documents cited in reporting around that contract describe the replenishment as critically needed, specifically to restore readiness after the inventory that got expended during Midnight Hammer. And there's an important operational detail buried in there too. The B-2 Spirit remains the only aircraft in the entire Air Force inventory actually programmed to carry and release this weapon. And during that original mission, each individual B-2 carried only 2 of these bombs at a time. That tells you the total number of MOPs that can actually be delivered in any single operation is inherently limited by how many stealth bombers you can get into the fight and how many each one can physically carry. This isn't a weapon you can surge in unlimited quantities even if you wanted to. There's also been continued discussion, going back a couple years now, about tripling total GBU-57 production capacity going forward, which tells you this isn't viewed as a one-time weapon built for a single mission and then quietly retired. This is being treated as a durable, ongoing strategic capability that the U.S. intends to keep and reserve, specifically for exactly this category of target, deeply buried, hardened facilities that an adversary builds specifically hoping to survive a conventional air campaign. I want to zoom out for a second because I think the real significance of this weapon goes beyond just the physical size of the bomb itself. What the GBU-57 actually provides is something the U.S. didn't reliably have before it was fielded, a way to hold at risk a category of target that an adversary specifically builds underground because they believe that depth alone makes them safe from conventional attack. Before this capability existed and was demonstrated in combat, a country building something like Fordow could reasonably calculate that even a full-scale conventional air campaign couldn't actually reach their most sensitive underground infrastructure, which meant the only way to genuinely threaten a facility like that was either a special operations ground raid, an extremely difficult and high-risk mission, or crossing into nuclear weapons territory entirely. Having a conventional weapon that can actually reach and destroy that category of target closes a real gap in what's sometimes called escalation management. It gives decision makers a serious military option against deeply buried targets without needing to reach for anything close to a nuclear response. That's precisely why the Air Force describes this weapon's mission specifically in terms of holding at-risk facilities tied to weapons of mass destruction and hardened leadership or command infrastructure. That's a deterrence function as much as it's a battlefield weapon. The mere existence and demonstrated combat effectiveness of this capability changes the calculation for any country thinking about building something like Fordow in the first place. A lot of people watching this have probably heard of the MOB, the mother of all bombs. That's the other massive American weapon that gets a lot of internet attention. And I want to clear up the difference because they're actually built for completely different jobs. The Moab, officially the GBU-43, is technically heavier in total weight than the MOP in some comparisons, but it carries a much larger overall explosive payload and it's designed as a blast weapon, meaning it's meant to detonate at or near the surface and create a massive above-ground pressure wave and blast radius, the kind of weapon you'd use against troop concentrations, cave and tunnel networks, or targets spread across an open area. The MOP is the opposite philosophy entirely. It actually carries less total explosive material than the Moab, but almost the entire design is built around penetration first and detonation second, the weapon's own weight, its hardened Eglin steel alloy casing, and its guidance system are all built specifically to survive smashing through hundreds of feet of rock and concrete without breaking apart, so that the explosive charge inside can actually go off in exactly the right place, deep underground, rather than uselessly detonating at the surface. Two very different jobs, two very different bombs, and it's worth understanding neither one is simply a bigger or smaller version of the other. They're built around entirely different physics problems. I also think it's worth talking about the fact that Iran wasn't caught completely flat-footed on this, at least not in the sense of having no warning at all. In the lead-up to the Midnight Hammer strikes, there was documented evidence of Iranian efforts specifically aimed at sealing up Fordow against exactly this kind of attack, including work on capping the facility's ventilation shafts, which, as I mentioned earlier, ended up being the exact access point the strike package used to actually get weapons down into the underground complex. That's part of what makes this such an interesting technical story rather than just a straightforward story of overwhelming force. Iran clearly understood, at some level, what kind of vulnerability those ventilation shafts represented, and made a real effort to close off that specific access point before the strike happened. The fact that the mission still succeeded, with the first weapon in each sequence specifically tasked with forcibly clearing that cap before the following weapons went in, tells you this was a genuine technical cat-and-mouse game playing out in real time between Iranian efforts to harden the facility and American targeting solutions, built to defeat exactly that kind of hardening. That's a much more interesting story than simply dropping a giant bomb on a stationary target. This was an adversary actively trying to adapt its defenses against a threat it at least partially anticipated, and a weapons program specifically engineered over 15 years to stay ahead of exactly that kind of adaptation. I also want to be upfront that there's real ongoing debate about exactly how effective these strikes actually were at eliminating Iran's underlying nuclear capability, as opposed to just the physical facilities themselves. Iran's own government has pushed back at various points on claims that its nuclear program was fully destroyed, and there's been credible reporting acknowledging that while the physical infrastructure at these sites sustained extremely severe damage, that's not automatically the same thing as eliminating Iran's broader technical knowledge base, or its ability to eventually reconstitute some version of that capability elsewhere, especially over a longer time frame. There's also a genuinely sobering detail that's come up in more recent reporting: concerns about unexploded ordnance, meaning some of these massive weapons may not have fully detonated as intended, and instead remain lodged inside these damaged facilities. That creates its own unusual and ongoing hazard, a mix of conventional unexploded munitions risk, combined with whatever radiological exposure concerns come with an unexploded weapon sitting inside a former nuclear enrichment environment. Iran's own foreign minister has publicly raised concerns along these lines, warning that strikes on the country's nuclear facilities created serious dangers, including possible radiation exposure. I want to flag that as a claim from an involved party rather than something I can independently verify. But it's a serious enough claim, and specific enough, that it's worth taking seriously as an open question rather than dismissing outright. Military assessments themselves have been fairly candid that final battle damage assessment takes real time to complete properly, and that initial assessments, however severe they sounded in the moment, aren't necessarily the final word on exactly what was and wasn't destroyed. One more piece worth explaining, because I don't want to gloss over it, is why the B-2 specifically had to be the aircraft for this mission, beyond just the fact that it's certified to carry the weapon. The B-2 Spirit is a flying wing design, no vertical tail, a shape and skin treatment specifically engineered to minimize radar cross-section, which is the same low observable philosophy I've talked about in other videos when discussing the F-35, just applied to a much larger long-range strategic bomber instead of a fighter. Getting deep into Iranian airspace to strike a target as heavily defended as Fordow, then getting back out safely, isn't something you can do with just any aircraft. You need a platform that can survive transiting contested airspace with a real, sophisticated air defense network trying to find and engage it. Interestingly, one defense analyst quoted in coverage of this war noted that by the time some of the later strikes happened, Israeli air dominance over Iran had already been established to the point where the need for stealth specifically had been reduced in some areas, which is part of why you saw other aircraft like B-1 Lancers getting used later in the war for different munitions. But for that original Midnight Hammer mission specifically, striking into defended Iranian airspace before that air dominance picture had been established, the B-2's stealth characteristics weren't optional. They were the entire reason that mission was survivable in the first place. That's part of why this weapon and this specific aircraft are so tightly linked in this story. The MOP's destructive capability against a hardened target is only useful if you can actually get it there safely to begin with. And for years, the B-2 was the only platform in the American arsenal that could reasonably promise that. All right, here's where I land on all this. I think Operation Midnight Hammer will end up being looked back on as one of the most technically significant strikes of this entire era, not because of the sheer tonnage involved, but because of what it actually proved was possible. For 15 years, this weapon existed on paper and in testing without ever being used in an actual mission against a real target that mattered this much. Watching it get employed successfully, with officials saying every single weapon reached exactly where it was intended to go against the single hardest target this program was ever built to defeat, that's a genuinely rare moment in military history where a highly specialized, extremely expensive, long development capability gets validated in real combat exactly the way it was designed to perform. I also think the Taliban 2 ambiguity is worth sitting with for a minute, because it's a good reminder that even in an era of satellite imagery and constant open source tracking, we still don't always get a clean, fully confirmed picture of exactly what happened in a specific strike, who conducted it, or what munitions were actually used. That kind of fog is normal in a war like this, and I think it's important not to fill in that uncertainty with confident claims, just because the visual evidence looks similar to something we've seen before. And I think the Boeing replenishment contract tells you everything about how the Pentagon actually views this weapon going forward. This isn't being treated as a one-off, dramatic moment from earlier in this war. It's being treated as a durable, ongoing piece of the American deterrent posture, specifically against hardened, deeply buried targets anywhere in the world, not just in Iran. Given how much of this current conflict has been shaped by exactly the kind of underground, hardened infrastructure this weapon was built to defeat, I don't think it's a stretch to say the GBU-57 has quietly become one of the most strategically important weapons in the entire American arsenal, even though it's used so rarely that most people watching this video probably hadn't heard much about it before this war put it on the map. So that's the story of the weapon behind some of the most consequential strikes of this entire war. 15 years in development, first used operationally against the single hardest target it was ever designed to defeat, possibly used again later in the same conflict under circumstances that are still genuinely unclear, and now being actively rebuilt and potentially expanded, given how much of its existing stockpile has already been used. I'll keep tracking how this weapon factors into whatever comes next in this war, especially if Bushehr or any other hardened Iranian facility ends up back in the target conversation the way we've discussed in some of my other recent videos. What do you guys think? Does having a weapon like this change the entire strategic calculation for a country thinking about building deeply buried military infrastructure in the future? Let me know in the comments below. I read everyone. If you learned something new about this weapon that you didn't know before, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It helps me keep putting out this kind of deep dive alongside the fast-moving news updates. Check out the video right here next. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.